Hello, welcome to Walk in the Word podcast. I'm your host, Al McMullen. This is episode 14 of my podcast, and this is part one of my series titled Job, a man who fears God and turns away from evil. In this episode, we're going to talk about the first characteristic trait of Job that would cause God to make this incredible statement about Job. There is no one like him on earth, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. I hope you listened to episode 13 as we gave an introduction to this series from the book of Job. In that episode, we explained the trial that Job was experiencing as God gave Satan permission to test Job. Satan had come before God seeking permission to test Job, but God insisted that there was no one else on earth like Job, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. Satan's reasoning was that God had blessed Job and had placed a hedge of protection around him. Satan insisted that if God would allow him to test Job, he would turn from God and curse him to his face. So God granted Satan permission with the stipulation that he couldn't take Job's life. So in the course of one day, Job lost all his possessions, including his children. Then three of Job's friends came to him, accusing him of some terrible sin in his life that would cause this calamity to come upon him. But through it all, Job held on to his integrity and never blamed God for his trial while maintaining his innocence before God. In chapter 31, Job gave his response to their accusation by listing 14 character traits that he practiced to maintain his innocence before God, which caused God to make that statement that there was no other man on earth like Job, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. So today we're going to look at that first character trait that he listed, which is sexual purity. So in Job 31, verses 1 through 4, we read, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. For what is our lot from God above, our heritage from the Almighty on high? Is it not ruin for the wicked, disaster for those who do wrong? Does he not see my ways and count my every step? And then we see in verses 9 through 12, Job says, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then may my wife grind another man's grain, and may other men sleep with her. For that would have been wicked, a sin to be judged. It is a fire that burns to destruction. It would have uprooted my harvest. Of the 14 character traits that Job has listed in his response, sexual purity was the first trait that he mentioned. I believe Job firmly nails down sexual purity as his primary principle for God's blessing on his life. Job's choice of sexual purity as his first principle should actually come as no surprise. After all, sexual infidelity has brought about problems to plenty of people throughout history, right up to today. It should not come as a surprise to know that according to a study from the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, infidelity is at the top of the list for reasons for divorce. Job must have understood the importance that God puts on the family. You know, the family was the first institution that God put in place, and it is the foundational institution of society ordained by God. We read in Genesis 2:34, a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. So by this verse, I think God meant that a man and his wife are to remain together for life, with no infidelity from either partner. God included sexual purity as part of the 10 Commandments, as he states in the 9th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You know, there are plenty of biblical accounts of the consequences of sexual impurity. One of the earliest accounts is Abraham. God had promised Abraham that his offspring would be the father of the nation of Israel. The problem was that Abraham's wife Sarah was barren, could not have children, and both were becoming older. Abraham became impatient with God and decided to take matters in his own hands. He took Sarah's maid and had a child with her. This wasn't the offspring that God wanted to be the father of his people. But God later intervened in the matter, and Sarah became pregnant in her old age and bore Isaac to Abraham. It was from him that the nation of Israel descended from. You know, the son that he had with Sarah's maid fathered a range of Arab nations. And we are seeing the consequences of that action still today. Another biblical example is King David, who was known as a man after God's own heart. He had become so complacent in his successes that one day when he should have been with his troops in battle, he stayed behind, and from his palace he noticed Bathsheba, who was one of his commander's wife, bathing. He lusted in his heart for her, and being king, called her and had an affair with her, and she became pregnant. David called her husband from the battlefield and told him to go be with his wife and take a break from the battle. David did this to try to cover up his sin. But her husband was a man of integrity, and because it was not permissible for a soldier to lie with his wife during a time of war, he didn't do what David asked him to. So David, being desperate to cover his sin, put her husband on the front lines of battle, knowing that he probably would be killed. He was indeed killed in battle, so David thought that he had hidden his sin from the world. David took Bathsheba as his wife, and she gave birth to a son. But his son became ill and died. When David was confronted with his sin by a prophet, David confessed his sin to God, and God forgave him. But it was not without consequences. For the rest of David's life, he was confronted with problems, including his own son trying to take the kingdom from him. David found out the hard way that sexual sins has its consequences, and those consequences can last a lifetime. Sexual sin is a big deal to God and can seriously impair God's ability or desire to bless us. Notice how Job started off describing his principle about sexual purity. He said, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. Now compare his words to those of Jesus in Matthew 5:28. Jesus said, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. We can see in these verses just how serious Job was about this sin and just how serious Jesus is about it too. It's evident from the verses we looked at earlier in chapter 31 that Job knew that we cannot hide our sins from God and that they are certainly consequences from our sins. So he placed sexual purity as the number one character trait that would please God. You know, it doesn't matter what the world thinks about this sin, as it seems to be very popular today, with people not considering the consequences from God. God's view about sexual purity has not changed with the times. His view is just as relevant today as it was in Job's day. The very first reason that God told Satan that there was no one else on earth like Job, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns from evil, was the fact that Job had demonstrated sexual purity throughout his life. The truth is that There are probably not many people who can make this claim and be honest about it. In today's society, infidelity has been forced on us as something that's okay and something that's normal. We see it on the television, see it in movies, magazines, novels, and social media. People accept it as normal behavior, but God doesn't. If we have any chance or desire to live a life that pleases God, sexual purity must be at the top of our list, just as it was with Job's list. God's view on sexual purity hasn't changed at all. It is the same today as it was in Job's life. The Bible has plenty to say about sexual purity, and here's just a few of those verses. 1 Corinthians 13:6-18 says, "Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexual immoral person sins against his own body." We see in Hebrews 13:4, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexual immoral. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says, "For this is God's will, your sanctification, that you keep away from sexual immorality." Proverbs 6:32 says, "The one who commits adultery lacks sins. Whoever does so destroys himself." By these verses, it's obvious that sexual purity is very important to God, and it should be to us too. Probably some of you who are listening to this podcast may be dealing with this sin in your life now. If you are, I've got good news for you. Jesus can and will forgive you if you will confess to God and turn away from it. 1 John 1:8-9 says, "If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness." As long as we're still living on this earth, we can ask for forgiveness and turn away from evil, just as Job did. Sexual purity is essential in our walk with God. So Job's first character trait that gave him favor with God is sexual purity. So in the next episode, we'll be looking at the second on Job's list. So be sure to check that out when it is posted. I want to take the time to thank everyone for your support of my podcast. And if you want to follow along with me in this study of Job, please click the follow link to receive future content as it's posted. If you have any questions, comments about this podcast, you can contact me by email at walkinthewordpodcast@gmail.com. So until next time, remember to walk in the Word every day. May God richly bless you.